Good morning, everybody. If I could ask everyone to take their seats. I'm Gavriel Rosenfeld, the president here at the Center for Jewish History. It's fitting that today's symposium is taking place during commencement season. At this very moment, in fact, graduating seniors across the country, including at my own university up in Connecticut, are listening to words of wisdom being imparted by accomplished valedictorians, PhD recipients who are getting their honorary degrees, and sundry celebrities. This year, however, many Jewish students, faculty, and staff are attending what should be festive occasions with trepidation, for their place on college campuses has never been more uncertain. So as we begin to address this problem in our symposium this morning, I would like to start my brief remarks by following the tradition of countless commencement speakers before me and drawing on the wisdom of a classic literary text. To paraphrase and to slightly amend Mark Antony's famous funeral oration from William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, I would like to propose that we have come here today neither to bury universities nor to praise them. We are not here to engage in Philippics or Jeremiads, but to analyze a contemporary problem, namely why American Jews are more uneasy than ever about their status on college campuses. In tackling this task, we will employ the tools of the historian's trade and historicize the problem in an effort to determine how it might be addressed. One thing that will emerge from today's discussion, I hope, is that Jewish concerns about American universities are far from new. They have surged and retreated in periods when American university life has itself been in turmoil, whether in the 1960s and 1970s, when some of the participants in today's symposium were college students and witnessed the rise of the New Left, or in the 1980s and 1990s, when other participants, such as myself, confronted the phenomenon of political correctness. Jews have always debated the meaning of these moments, but there's no question that the present crisis has disturbingly novel features. Not only has the question of campus anti-Semitism loomed larger than at any time since the 1930s, but it has also become a political football, as we're all aware, in a broader American debate about the nature, purpose, and future of higher education. At a time when universities are being subjected to economic sanctions by the federal government, and at a time when nonprofit cultural institutions like this one here at the Center for Jewish History are being adversely affected by capricious budget cuts, it's important that Jews fully understand how contemporary threats compare with past struggles. Only then can we determine whether some of the solutions currently being proposed are suitable for or are potentially worse than the problems they are meant to solve. This morning, we have gathered a wide range of distinguished scholars, journalists, and other commentators to reflect on how we can move forward, in part by looking backward. This has been the goal of the Jewish Public History Forum since its creation 2 years ago, which has tackled such varied topics as American Zionism, interwar fascism, 20th century American immigration, and also contemporary anti-Semitism. We have always welcomed speakers representing different perspectives, and today's event follows in that tradition. I'm grateful to everyone for joining us this morning, and I'd like to begin by thanking the chairman of our symposium, Marty Peretz, who, to formally kick off our symposium, I would like to welcome up to the podium David Wolpe. He is the Max Webb Emeritus Rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles and the scholar-in-residence of the Maimonides Fund. For the past 2 years, he has served as the inaugural Rabbinic Fellow at the Anti-Defamation League, and he will begin our symposium with some reflections about the current moment. Please join me in welcoming up David to the podium.
I think that it's probably appropriate to start off by saying that, like many of you, for many, many, many years, I was a devoted reader of the New Republic, and we are so grateful to Marty Peretz for those years of an exemplary magazine. It is an ageless accomplishment. So, many years ago, I was supposed to team teach with Rabbi Lawrence Kushner a class for the rabbis of Bergen County. And the day before the class, we didn't have a title. So I called him in a panic, and I said, Larry, we need a title. And he said, I have a title that always works. Judaism at the Crossroads. And I thought, it is extraordinary how well that title only grows greater over time. And in preparing for today, what I actually remembered was that when my daughter who's now a postdoc, was a teenager, shortly after her bat mitzvah, I took her to Paris. I took her there because I wanted her to be able to say in later years, the first man who took me to Paris was my father. But we went on successive days to the Louvre and then to the Jewish Museum. And when we got to the Jewish Museum in Paris, those of you that have been there know that one door opens, you go in, the door closes, then the next door opens and you go in. And I said to her, did you notice that the security here is tighter than it was at the Louvre? And she looked at me with that look that teenagers know how to give their parents who are foolish and said, of course, Dad, it's the Jewish Museum. And actually that answer broke my heart, because I thought already we have haunted her with historical memories sufficient that she knows that Jews are not safe in this world. Were she a teenager today, I think the answer wouldn't have surprised me at all. Because there is no longer any means of persuading ourselves that our kids are going to grow up in a world in which they will not know the prejudices that so many of our predecessors have faced. And I wanted to speak in that shadow about my experience at Harvard for the year, the annus horribilis, and talk about the qualities that I think were necessary for the university to have done better than it did and why it didn't have them. The first one was honesty. I remember speaking to the former president of Harvard, this is now very topical, and talking to her about Harvard taking money from foreign governments, and she said to me, we don't take money from foreign governments, only from families. And I said, the family that runs Qatar is a family in the sense that the family that runs the mafia is a family. But you understand that there are constraints on the honesty of a president of a university in the same way, and I hate to shock you with this, as there are constraints on the rabbi of a congregation. Wasn't my daughter wonderful at the bat mitzvah? Yes, she was wonderful. But in addition to honesty, there was a lack of empathy. Jewish students were outside the orbit of empathy. They were abstractly an object of concern. But the only person who genuinely expressed deep empathy in my school, which was Harvard Divinity School, that's where I was teaching, was a German woman on the staff whose eyes literally filled with tears at what was going on at the university. I thought that that was significant in 1,000 ways that I will let you unpack. Third was humility. When I would say to people, because having weathered crises in a synagogue, I kept saying, this is just going to get worse, the answer I got in almost these words was, you don't understand, this is Harvard. And in case that isn't clear, what we mean by that is, this is Harvard. One past president expressed it to me by saying, this is the most important NGO in the world. And I think that part of the reason that at least at some of the universities they had the crisis they did was not only because it was the first time they had protests against other students, right? Not against a cause, but also because there was a certain hubris with being an elite university that was hard to shake. And then lastly, there was a failure of courage. Because one of the qualities that is important in leadership is the ability to be disagreeable. You know those primary emotional traits, and one of them is agreeableness? Well, you don't actually generally get to be a president of a university, just like you don't get to be generally a rabbi at a synagogue, unless you score high on agreeableness, but then sometimes you have to do disagreeable things. And that is difficult for people who are used to being agreeable. And in order to be a leader, sometimes you have to be disagreeable. Now, we know leaders who abuse the privilege, but in general, you get the idea that courage is required to go against your faculty, your staff, your peers, sometimes the public. And those omissions all reflected a profound shift in values. Alistair McIntyre said that the purpose of a university was to initiate students into the conflict. But actually, we didn't do that. Instead, part of the pathology of the demonstrations or the strategy was actually to refuse discussion. I approached the encampments several times and asked students to speak to me. Sometimes they refused, and sometimes they said, "We were told not to speak to you." I remember thinking that Newman, in his idea of a university, said, and you can think about your own university, how true this is, this observation. He said, a university does many things, but one thing it does not do is intellectualize its neighborhood. I went to Penn. I can just think of the neighborhood around Penn. That is so true. But in this case, what the university did not do was intellectualize its students. It did not initiate them into the world of discourse, and instead it showed them that you are much more effective if you don't talk. Because if you do, you are just giving credibility or platforming, to use that awful word, the people who you know are evil. I think it is going to be addressed any number of times today, the question, why the Jews? Why did this explode into the cause that it did, and why questions are almost always overdetermined? And I could spend a lot of time that I don't have giving you reasons, but at least one metaphor I want to offer to you for a reason we're all familiar with. We heard endlessly about DEI and why DEI was good or bad, depending on which side of the fence you sat on. But here is a way to think about it that, if you don't know the theory behind it, may help. Structurally, you understand, every group should end up the same. When I say you understand, that's in quotes. So that if a group does less well, then it can't be because of the group itself. It must be because of the structure of the society and the historical experience of the group. Therefore, if a group does too well, and you cannot find that reason in the history of the group, it has to be found in the structure of society. And the reason that DEI is intrinsically hostile to Jews is because Jews overachieve. And the only explanation that is acceptable is the game is rigged in Jewish favor. The analogy that I use is the only way that you get an even lawn is with a lawnmower. You can't get it with fertilizer. So it doesn't matter how much you help certain groups, unless you cut others down, you can't get the equality that DEI proposes, is the only evidence that a society is good. And guess where that leaves us? Now, I could give you other reasons why I think the university blew up, but I note, not as a complaint, but to solicit your gratitude, that I was given a very strict time limit. And that wasn't so much to keep the conference moving as it was because they saw that I was used to giving sermons, and therefore it was important to let me know that one was not permitted. So I hope you will forgive me for finishing with a sermonic flourish, because you can't ask a rabbi to speak without getting a story from the Talmud. So here goes to conclude. Don't get too excited, the story takes a minute, but to conclude, here is the story from the Talmud. We're going to be talking today about whether Jews still belong in elite universities. And I certainly don't think that we should abandon great citadels of learning or be chased out of them, although to be there takes fortitude that I don't think should be asked of every student. So I'm going to give a selective answer, it depends who. But one of the things that you have heard and that has been controversial is how much money, how many scholarships, how many chairs, how many buildings we have given over the years to all of these institutions, and that's true. But in the Talmud, there is this beautiful story of two men passing the ruins of an ancient synagogue. And one of them says, Kama mamon shichu avotenu kan. How much money did our ancestors invest in this place? And his friend corrects him. And he says, Kama nefashot shichu avotenu kan. How many souls did our ancestors invest in this place? You know, it was a dream of our ancestors that Jews be able to go to places like Harvard and Stanford and Yale and Princeton and on, and certainly Columbia. It was their dream, and they invested their souls in enabling their children and their grandchildren to realize that dream. With all my caveats, and I know all of yours, I'm not ready to give up on the entire investment of all those souls because others have been so cruel, so thoughtless, so blunt and coarse and even evil in the treatment of their descendants. How many souls have we invested? The answer is a lot. And my guess is we are not done. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for those wonderful remarks. If I could call up the participants for panel number one, we are going to get started with our first of 4 sessions.
The Republic in your era was something very special, a definition of American liberalism that is weakened profoundly, and there's a hole in our political culture that still remains to be filled. So I'm very pleased to be here and try to fill that hole and participate with my colleagues. The public opinion survey was invented in the 1930s in the United States by Roper and Gallup, and they kept asking questions measuring anti-Semitism before and then during World War II. In spring of 1944, when American troops were hitting the beaches in Normandy, according to Charles Stember's work on anti-Semitism in American history, those polls registered the highest amount of public anti-Semitism in American history in June of 1944 when American soldiers hit the beaches. Then, with the revelations of the Holocaust in the summer of 1945 began a gradual decline of anti-Semitism and a gradual opening of the universities in in a way that was a slight pushback against the decisions that Rebecca described so very well. At Columbia University, there was a graduate student named Raoul Hilberg who had a doctoral advisor named Franz Neumann. Franz Neumann was a lawyer in Berlin who fled Nazi Germany, came to the United States, and was the director of research and analysis regarding the Nazi regime for the Office of Strategic Services in Washington, D.C. during the Second World War. And Franz Neumann was a professor at Columbia. He died tragically young in an automobile accident. But he advised Hilberg's dissertation, which became the classic work, The Destruction of the European Jewry. The Columbia of those years was also the Columbia of Telford Taylor, who many of you will recall was one of the prosecutors of the Nuremberg war crimes trials. And it was that Columbia that had room for a young scholar named Fritz Stern, whose Politics of Cultural Despair, which was the revision of his doctoral dissertation, was published in 1964. And these stories from that Columbia, which is so different from the Columbia of Rashid Khalidi and Edward Said, and the Columbia of recent decades, is a Columbia that reflects a shift from the margins of American historical profession to the center as it concerns the study of the Nazi regime, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. In 2012, I participated in a wonderful conference at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., entitled The Second Generation, Emigres from Nazi Germany and American Historians, and organized by Andreas Daum, Hartmut Lehmann, the superb director of the Institute, and the Stanford historian James Sheehan. There are 21 essays in that volume, which were published by Berghahn Books, and those of you who are interested in the shift to prominence, from margins to prominence in the American historical profession, when Jews and some non-Jews who wanted to write about the history of anti-Semitism were able to gain a foothold in our universities, including some of our elite universities. It's important to know that the contribution of the Ivy League, on the whole, to the historiography of the Holocaust, the historiography of Nazi Germany, is modest. And most of the most important works regarding anti-Semitism, Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust came from the margins of American intellectual life, from people such as Lucy Davidovich at YIVO, or Raoul Hilberg, who became a professor at the University of Vermont, from George Mossey, one of my professors at the University of Wisconsin. There was nothing marginal about, or non-elite about, the University of Wisconsin. Stern, Walter Laqueur, who became a Washington intellectual but a leading historian of the Holocaust, Gerhard Weinberg, who was a professor at Chicago and then University of North Carolina, and Saul Friedlander, whose formative years were in Israel and in Europe. One thinks as well of Yehuda Bauer, the Israeli historian, who just died. That generation trained my generation. And yet my generation of historians who did further work on Nazism and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust also found jobs largely at universities other than the classic Ivy League institutions. In 2016, in that conference, and then the volume came out in 2016, I wrote the following: though the impulse to address Jewish questions in German history now no longer comes only from scholars outside Germany, the one-sided irritation with Israel that has become fashionable among many European and American intellectuals may eventually push Jewish questions back to the periphery of the discipline, or perhaps to the preoccupation with dead Jews that will fit quite well into a mood of hostility to live Israelis. Whether there is reason to wonder, I wrote, now 10 years ago, whether the integration of the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust will remain in the main narrative of German and European history, whether it will stay there in the center, or whether anti-Semitism, when expressed by the far left and by Islamists, will receive the attention it deserves and these remain open questions. Will the hostility to Israel that is now an enduring feature of left-wing and much liberal sentiment in the universities on both sides of the Atlantic erode an interest in scholarship on these matters? As history departments in this country turn more resources to the study of Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Middle East, and explain to their students what is terrible, generally, about Western culture, the focus on Europe as a whole becomes relatively less central to the historical profession. And I think the answer to those questions today is largely one of pessimism, and that the young George Mossey, the young Fritz Stern, my students who are attempting to move issues from the margins to the mainstream regarding left-wing or Islamist anti-Semitism will have far more difficulty than did that generation that was welcomed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The rise of the Holocaust in the American historical profession as a matter of study was greeted with some skepticism and irritation, that this was a matter of special pleading, and the main event of American history, of course, we all know, concerned questions of color, not religion. So the question of whether we are entering a new era of anti-Semitism in American universities. And when I use the word elite, historians, there are distinctions in American universities between what are called Research 1 and Research 2 universities. A Research 1 university is basically a university in which faculty members have lower teaching loads and are expected to continue to publish over the course of their careers. And so in that sense, the University of Wisconsin or the University of Maryland are, quote, elite institutions, not in the popular mind, but within the historical profession. And historians know that you can get off an airplane in a lot of small towns in many of our 50 states and come to give a lecture and then have lunch with colleagues who are incredibly smart and published a lot. And while the colleagues at the Ivy League are generally excellent, there are excellent people all over the United States, and that's important to keep in mind. So this rephrasing of the question about anti-Semitism in the future should be rephrased as follows. There will be jobs in the future for Jews in elite universities. The question is whether there will be jobs for Jews in American universities in the humanities and social sciences who think that the state of Israel is not a racist, apartheid, genocidal, aggressive, imperialist, settler colonial entity that needs to be destroyed. Will there be jobs for historians such as a young Jeffrey Herf, who thinks that the state of Israel is a massive contribution to humanity and that has many virtues and that has the right to defend itself, is by no means perfect, has deep problems. But the question rephrased, will there be a future for those young scholars who can be defined with that now epithet, Zionist? That's the question. In 2007, how much time do I have left? Oh, wonderful. In 2007, Bernard Lewis, then teaching at Princeton, and Fuad Ajami, then teaching at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., founded something called the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa. The acronym is ASMIA. They founded it because it was clear to them by 2007 that the Middle East Studies Association had been intellectually captured and captivated by the views of Edward Said and Rashid Khalidi, and that overwhelmingly it was the sheer force of numbers as well was producing a subdiscipline that was now profoundly hostile, not criticizing this or that policy of the state of Israel, but questioning its moral and political legitimacy. And therefore, Lewis and Ajami formed ASMIA. ASMIA meets every year in Washington, D.C., and because I live in Silver Spring, it is easy for me to attend the conferences, and I have done so on a regular basis. And I can tell you that the scholars of the Middle East from elite universities, both the Ivy League and around the United States, are notable by their absence. In 2022, the Middle East Studies Association voted something like, these are approximate figures, of 820 to 160 to pass a boycott resolution against Israel. So a young scholar trying to get a job teaching Middle East studies who had the views of those of us who think Israel has a right to exist would find it a very difficult point. I conclude in 20 seconds. The sledgehammer is not preferable to what Rabbi Wolpe so eloquently described as the need for courage from university leaders. We do not need a purge of American universities of people who despise the state of Israel. There are many, but we do not want that purge. What we want is pluralism. What we want are Middle East studies scholars who will be willing to make the very serious and well-grounded scholarly case that the state of Israel is something other than what its adversaries have described for so many years. And that key word of pluralism is, should be the watchword. And how will that pluralism come? I hope it does not come from the federal sledgehammer. I hope it comes from university presidents, deans, and provosts who, as the rabbi put it so well, will be willing to be polite, diplomatic, but when necessary, disagreeable, and oppose the views even of the senior faculty. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
So it's true that I was a member of Columbia SDS. I joined in more or less in high school in 1965 and then entered Columbia in 1967 and was an active part in the revolution that went on to take place in the spring of 1968. I have to correct the wonderful Marty Peretz on one point, because he referred to a photograph that I showed him of the uprising. Black students were definitely involved. The strike, the big Columbia strike in 1967 was led by two organizations equally. Students for Democratic Society was mostly white, but not entirely. And the second organization was the Student Afro-American Society. And those two organizations were strictly in alliance. And I have to say that of those two organizations, there were many crazy currents of thought running around at that time, as everyone knows. But the crazy currents of thought were stronger in SDS than in SAS. SDS started off as a very sensible youth auxiliary to the social democratic unions. It was a descendant precisely of the Socialist Party of Morris Hillquit and those people. It was a very sensible, liberal, social democratic organization which proceeded then to go crazy. It went really crazy and finally imploded. But the Student Afro-American Society was entirely sane. And out of SDS at Columbia came the Weather Underground and all kinds of violence. Out of SAS at Columbia came nothing of that sort. Nothing. So the black students were the soul of intelligence and common sense and maturity at Columbia in 1968. It's only unfortunate they didn't have more influence, but they did have a great deal of influence. So it's worth remembering that. How all of that impacted me, I have to say, for me, my intellectual development began with that, and I looked back on what were the very sensible roots, I think, of Students for a Democratic Society, and I like to think that I've maintained some allegiance to that. But it's true that a large American left or student left has descended from what I think of as the crazy episodes of SDS. And when I see very clearly that at Columbia during the last year or two, there are many references back to 1968. There's a kind of a sentimentality of 1968, but it's an indiscriminate sentimentality. And as I see it, and and the connection therefore from SDS in those times to the encampments and the chants for Intifada and the little red inverted triangles and all these invocations of Hamas, the connection from one to the other seems to me quite perverse. It's a perverse development. But let me zoom out from that a little bit to say that sometimes it's a mistake to focus too excessively on the left or on the student left, because the problem we're addressing is larger than that. And if I zoom out a little bit, I'll make another recollection that at Columbia I was drawn to for a while to the study of English literature, and English literature at Columbia was very strong, and that's because of chiefly because of one figure whose name didn't come up in the discussion of Columbia history. Great figure who became a student precisely at the moment when Rebecca's history more or less comes to an end, and this was Lionel Trilling, who became a student in 1921 or 1922 and became the first major Jewish professor at Columbia, and began to dominate a certain culture at Columbia, which had a Jewish component, absolutely. And that culture has a one-word label. It's a funny word because 8 syllables and with 2 hyphens, but it is a single word, which is literature and politics. So literature and politics was an approach to thinking about literature and politics, which was not academic, which was literary, which could cross the disciplines, which was unconcerned with the disciplines, and which did not address itself principally to an academic audience, but addressed itself to the audience that Trilling used to refer to as the educated class, but I think is better described with the Russian word intelligentsia. So that was the great tradition at Columbia. But in 1967 and 8, when I was studying literature, a kindly professor took me under his wing and advised me, and saw immediately that I was drawn to this kind of thing, literature and politics, and saw that I should study this. But the great figure, Trilling, was still there. But he was old. I didn't take his course. My professor understood that Trilling was going to be much too conservative for a young hothead like me, and Trilling wasn't the right place to go. But there was an heir to Trilling, a successor, the new, young, brilliant figure within the English department, whom no one had ever heard of because he was so young, and he had published very little, but his brilliance was already established. So I took his course, and that was Edward Said. So I mention this to say that the trajectory from a social democratic, a liberal and social democratic youth movement to a mass uprising that invokes Hamas and the triangles and the horrible slogans and all that. That trajectory is not just that of the left or the student left. It was also the trajectory of some elements, at least, of the English department. But then again, of other departments too. So if we zoom out, we see the problem is a little larger. But let me zoom out again to say that I think there's a mistake, a potential distortion of perception that comes from focusing too much on universities themselves. That the problem we're actually addressing is more than a university problem, and it is a problem, I think, that is described again by the Russian word intelligentsia. The academics are members of the intelligentsia, but there are other members too. And the actual home of the intelligentsia is not the classroom or the university. The actual home of the intelligentsia is the bookstore. And when you go to the bookstore, that is not the chain stores, but the independent bookstore, there you really see the problem. Because on one hand, you'll see quite a pile of books calling in one way or another for the abolition of Israel, the anti-Zionist books, which are written by the most talented and distinguished and respected of authors. And that book pile will be high. And on the other hand, you will see some books calling for the opposite. And that book pile will be low. So the situation in the bookstores is very alarming. it's not just the a couple of scandalous incidents where some author or personality suspected of Zionist sympathies has been turned away from the store, and there have been such incidents. It's the normal situation in the bookstore that ought to catch our attention. The normal situation is that the entire climate of opinion has veered into the zone of anti-Zionism. And this is clearer at the bookstore, even clearer at the bookstore than it is at the university. Now, let me zoom out again to say, why should this be troubling? And it's for this reason. Everybody knows that in the last 150 years, virtually the entire Jewish population of the world has fled from one place to another. So it's very hard to meet a Jew whose great-great-grandparents lived in the same country that the Jew in front of you lives in. Everybody has fled. And ultimately, the flight has been either to the United States or the so-called Anglo-Saxon countries, or to Palestine, which became Israel. So the call for the fad or fashion or change in the climate of opinion that calls for anti-Zionism is a call to render 50% of the world's Jewish population stateless, and to roll back whatever progress was made in giving the Jews a place in the world, or a second place in addition to the United States. So now let me zoom out again to say, why should that alarm us, this change of opinion in the climate of opinion? And the answer to that is October 7. Now, I understand that in relation to October 7, some very intelligent military analysts assure us that nothing about October 7 or the subsequent events has really put Israel's existence into question. That Israel is a mighty military force, and terrible things have happened, but Israel's existence has never really been in question. So that's one interpretation, but we don't really know, and there is another interpretation. I think the other interpretation is that Israel's existence has been put into question. This is why President Biden sent a large percentage of the United States Navy to the waters off Israel in the first days after October 7, because there was a military question. I think also, and I'm just speculating this, or I'm making this up, but I ask myself, why has the IDF done so abysmally badly in Gaza? What can explain the monstrous brutality, the excessive brutality, combined with the military inefficiency, the inability to define an achievable goal and to achieve it, the floundering for a year and a half, unlike any other military campaign in Israel's history, and unlike the campaign in Lebanon, which was planned for many years and then was acted on with great efficiency and without that kind of monstrous brutality. And the only explanation I can come up with is that in the IDF, though no one will admit it, there's also a panic. And that the IDF has failed so terribly in Gaza out of a military panic. And the government of Israel itself is in a panic, which, in my interpretation, we can see by its inability to maneuver diplomatically, and its failures in Gaza. So, let me say very quickly what can be done about this. I would say in the universities, insofar as the universities are the problem, I don't really believe in the bureaucratic solutions. I respect Alan Garber very much, but I see really he's calling for reasoned debate. And so I'm for reasoned debate. But it's a very troubling debate, because it's a debate between people who think that the Jews should be able to defend themselves and people who think that the Jews should not be able to defend themselves. So it's a horrifying debate to engage in, even if one has to engage in the debate. As for Trump, it ought to be obvious that Trump's efforts are going to bring about the exact opposite of what his admirers think is going to come about. There's no example in modern history of a large vein of thought stamped out by a government or executive action. We had the experience of McCarthyism at its height in 1954, and by 1964, a vast pro-Soviet Marxist renaissance was going on in the American universities. We had the experience in Eastern Europe on the other side, where the communists came to power in 1945, 1948, and enacted, worse than McCarthyism, Stalinist totalitarianism. And yet by early 1990, I was in Prague, and every second person I met wanted to regale me with an account of the virtues and brilliance of Margaret Thatcher, which is to say that 45 years of totalitarian repression had failed to stamp out ideas. You cannot stamp out ideas with government action or administrative action. It can't be done. So how can it be done? And the only answer is through a battle of ideas and writers and thinkers through argument. And here I would just recall a little nostalgically that Columbia back in the day played a distinguished role. Lionel Trilling was very good on this, or the greatest of all, I think, was Daniel Bell, at who we students hated, but who turned out to be right on which many of us have acknowledged. And so figures like that at Columbia played a great role, but not administratively. They played that role through argument and intellectual work. So.